The gospel readings for the 4 Sundays in August have all come from what is many times called the Bread of Life Discourse, a talk delivered by Jesus in the synagogue at Capernaum. Because John's gospel does not include an account of the blessing of the bread during the Last Supper, this talk, which makes up most of John chapter 6, has often been interpreted as a communication of Jesus' teachings about the Eucharist. But today, I want to step back for a moment to the story that we read right before the Bread of Life discourse, the one that serves as sort of an introduction to this discourse, if you will. It begins chapter 6 of John's Gospel, and we read it this year on the last Sunday of July. It was a story about a whole lot of hungry people who had come to hear Jesus preach. One of Jesus' disciples, Philip, realized that this crowd would need something to eat, but he also realized that the disciples had nowhere near enough money to get lunch for these people. Then another disciple, Andrew, when he heard what the problem was, said, "Wait a minute. There's a little boy with 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. But how will that ever be enough to feed all these people?" But we know the rest of the story. Jesus asked the hungry folks to sit down. He passed out lunch. He thanked God. He passed out lunch. Everyone ate all they wanted, and the disciples picked up the leftovers. Way more leftovers than what that little boy had shared to begin with. And it all began with 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. Now, my story this morning begins in September of 2012. Not with fish and loaves, but with 35 bags of rice and beans. I had arrived as the new rector at St. Mary's Church in Andalusia in the summer of 2011. Now, somewhere I had heard or read that it would be a good idea for churches to have a signature outreach ministry, an outreach effort which would identify them in the community, would define who they were, both to those inside the parish and to those outside. So not long after I arrived, we began having meetings for anyone who was interested to talk about an outreach ministry like this at St. Mary's. It soon became clear that for St. Mary's, whatever outreach effort we pursued had to be about food. St. Mary's had a reputation for good cooks, for second Sunday potlucks after church. I always said that being the rector at St. Mary's had one huge challenge, and that was not gaining 400 pounds during the time you were rector there. We also had a fundraiser that was held every year. It was a gigantic Cajun feast. We sold out 300 tickets every year. Plus, we cooked Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners for the community. Anything we were going to do had to be about food. And we agreed fairly early on in our discussions that we didn't need to recreate the wheel. Now, I had heard an idea from our friend Bill King, an idea about something called a rice and beans ministry. So we decided that our rice and beans ministry at St. Mary's would be open to everyone, to all who showed up, no questions asked or identification required, on the 3rd Sunday morning of each month. We figured that if you got a Social Security check or a paycheck at the beginning of the month, by the 3rd Saturday, there might be some holes in your pantry that we could help fill. So in September of 2012, with those 35 bags, each containing 3 pounds of rice and 2 pounds of beans, a sign sitting on the street outside the church, and an announcement on a local radio station, we began our ministry. About a week before we opened by the first time, word was getting around town about what we were doing, and I encountered a local elected official who talked to me about this ministry, and he questioned whether there were people poor enough and hungry enough in our community to be willing to come on a Saturday morning for a bag of rice and beans. My answer to this official was, we'll see. It was simple and it was pretty small, but people did come. A few months after we began, a simple to-go breakfast was added. A parishioner asked me if I thought it would be a good idea for her to make sack breakfast to hand out with the food. And the first time we did this, it was a biscuit and a hard-boiled egg. And soon, the breakfast served was enhanced. My other comment about food at St. Mary's is that food at St. Mary's was never simple. Breakfast soon became a sit-down affair with decorated tables, takeouts if you wanted them, usually something like a plate of scrambled eggs with cheese, sausage, biscuit, cheese grits, fresh fruit, coffee, juice, milk, and all the other necessities for breakfast. Over time, we added additional food items to give away. A loaf of bread, a bag of non-perishable groceries like peanut butter, jelly, a can of soup, tuna, vegetables, or fruit, plus the rice and beans for which we were named. The other thing that happened was that other people and other groups around town knew what was happening on the third Saturday at St. Mary's and wanted to get involved. Most of these without us even asking. A high school club called and asked if their students could come and volunteer with us on Saturday mornings so that they could get service hours. Of course. And they also started having a food drive in November. Now, living in Alabama, it's not surprising that this was an Alabama-Auburn food drive, and whoever brought the most canned goods won. I have to say that I did have to stop them bringing large containers of oil because they found out that weighed an awful lot. It really wasn't useful for our food ministry. The local Latter-day Saints missionaries called me and said, could we come volunteer? Of course. The local Humane Society started taking broken bags of food that had been donated them by a store in town and started repackaging it so that we could give pet food to our guests for their pets. A community college service club partnered with us to do a coat and blanket drive every winter as the weather started getting cooler. And the local affiliate of Dolly Parton's Imagination Library that sent books to children every month for 5 years after they were born, every month they had books that were returned because someone had moved or whatever, and they brought the returned books to us so that we could give books to children when they came on Saturday mornings. Of course, growth in our ministry meant that we needed more money. In 2014, we held the first annual St. Mary's 5K and fun run for rice and beans. Ask me sometime and I'll bring some of my t-shirts to show you. We had a new one every year, and an artist in our parish made a really cool drawing of Mary with her veil over her head, with ginormous running shoes on, and a bag of rice in one hand and a bag of beans in the other as she ran. Race sponsorships from local businesses and organizations became our major funding source. There was also another kind of growth. Another church in our diocese began a similar ministry, and the Presbyterian church in town began offering lunch one morning and breakfast one afternoon, during lunch one noontime and breakfast one morning each month. We shared what we had learned with them. They came and worked with us a couple Saturdays, although clearly their ministries were unique to them and their congregations. Always, from the very beginning at our rice and beans ministry, we had a small repurposed sewing box on a little stand. I think someone purchased it at a yard sale. We had that sewing box and a stack of note cards at the door so that All of our guests, if they wanted to, could leave an anonymous prayer request on the note cards in that box. On Sunday morning, the next day after Rice and Beans, we would distribute those note cards to members of the parish who would agree to pray for that request for the next month. Now, everyone agreed to pray for a month, but I personally knew someone who kept every one of her note cards and continued to pray for that person who had left it, even though she didn't know their name, probably still prays for them to this day. Before COVID, most Saturdays we gave away over 100 units, that means rice, beans, a loaf of bread, and non-perishable food, to take home, and we served over 200 breakfasts. Of course, there were modifications during COVID. We couldn't have sit-down breakfasts, and we posted a table at the door with the doors wide open to hand food to people. Now things are back to normal post-COVID with that ministry. The bread of life. It's the food that feeds our souls. And we most often think of it as what we receive when we come to this table. We meet Jesus here in a real way as the bread is distributed. But at our Rice and Beans ministry, we found that we also met Jesus in a real way in the kitchen, cooking breakfast for people, handing them a loaf of bread and a bag of food to take home, even putting on a community race to raise money. We experienced all the challenges and all the rewards that come anytime we get close to Jesus and the work that Jesus gives us to do. We were fed the bread of life as we made relationships with our guests and as we prayed for them. The author, priest, and preacher Barbara Brown Taylor has written about finding altars in the world and writes beautifully about the altar we find when we encounter other people and build community in the practice of service. At St. Mary's, we found an altar in the world, an altar in our parish hall kitchen and around plastic tables. Miracles happen there at that altar, just as they happen at this altar. You may have heard me speak in another sermon about the miraculous journey of forgiveness that my friend Deborah began as she handed a plate of scrambled eggs to the mother of the man who had murdered her father. We saw a miracle unfold in the life of a woman named Dawn, who first came as one of our guests, but then became a member of our congregation, joined the choir, was confirmed, and became a dedicated volunteer at our Rice and Beans ministry. But we always made sure that a loaf of bread and a bag of canned goods and a bag of rice and beans were reserved for Dawn that she could take home after her volunteer shift. Dawn was in what we came to learn was an abusive relationship. It was the people she met at that ministry who helped her get to a safe place in another state and free from that relationship. That was a whole series of miracles. And we experienced the miracle of community, working together in the parish, working with others in the larger community, and seeing the friendships that formed around those tables on Saturday mornings. I will never forget, there were several women who started coming to our Rice and Beans ministry to get food. They knew each other. It was a small town, so not surprising. But they would sit together and eat on Saturday mornings. And before long, our parish hall became the place that they had birthday parties in months when the members of their group of friends had birthdays. This morning here at All Saints, we are welcoming 4 new souls. Meredith was at our 8:30 service, Emerson, Miller, and Rosie at this service to this table, as the water of baptism is poured over their sweet heads. We welcome them to share the bread of life with us here at this altar and at all the other altars in the world where I am sure they will find Jesus. Altars where no doubt miracles will happen and community will be built. Now, you may have already noticed, or I hope you will notice soon, a phrase here at All Saints. Work together, expect miracles. Work together, expect miracles. I love that phrase, and I believe it because I've seen it. Amen.